In the quiet heart of the countryside, far from the constant buzz of city lights and the relentless cacophony of urban noise, that's where the real dark secrets tend to live, festering just beneath the surface of perceived tranquility. These are the places where the shadows seem to stretch and move all on their own, where the wind carries whispers that don't sound quite natural, and where unexplained cries can echo through vast, empty fields, reaching no one, or perhaps reaching exactly who they were meant for. The pastoral landscapes, so beautiful by day, can transform into stages for the truly unsettling when night falls, revealing a side of rural life that many would prefer to ignore, a side that reminds us that not all open spaces are safe spaces. Tonight we're peeling back that picturesque veneer. We're venturing deep into those isolated corners of the world, into the heart of the strange, dark and mysterious, to bring you 3 true countryside horror stories. These aren't tales spun from pure fiction. These are accounts of chilling encounters, of unexplained phenomena, and of fear so palpable it will seep into your bones and haunt your nights long after the screen goes dark. These stories come from people who experienced something out there, something that defied explanation, something that changed them. They serve as a stark reminder that even in the most idyllic settings, terror can find a way to take root and grow, unseen until it's far too late. These narratives are designed to make you check your locks twice, to make you wary of that rustling sound outside your window, and to perhaps make you think differently about those long, lonely country roads. Each story is a descent into a unique kind of rural dread, where the familiar becomes alien and the silence is broken by things that should not be. We're talking about encounters that leave scars, not just on the mind, but sometimes on the very soul. Prepare yourselves, because the tales we're about to share are not for the faint of heart. They are a journey into the heart of fear itself, where the ordinary twists into the terrifying. So if you're a fan of the strange, dark and mysterious delivered in story format, well, you've come to the right place. Do us a favor and gently tap that like button and consider subscribing if you haven't already. It really helps us bring more of these unsettling tales to you. And as we begin, allow this fade-in horror sound effect to set the mood for the shadows we're about to explore. Because tonight, sleep might just be a luxury you can't afford after hearing what lurks out there, just beyond the glow of the city, waiting in the patient, watchful darkness of the countryside. All right, so for our first story, we're heading out to the vast, open plains of rural Nebraska. Now, if you've never been, picture this. Endless stretches of farmland, cornfields that seem to go on forever, and a sky so big it feels like it could swallow you whole. It's the kind of place where the silence at night is so profound, it's almost a sound in itself. During the day, it's all golden fields and blue skies, the epitome of American heartland beauty. But when the sun dips below that enormous horizon and the darkness rolls in like a heavy blanket, that same isolation can take on a far more unsettling quality. All right, so for our first story, we're heading out to the vast, open plains of rural Nebraska. Now, if you've never been, picture this. Endless stretches of farmland, cornfields that seem to go on forever, and a sky so big it feels like it could swallow you whole. It's the kind of place where the silence at night is so profound, it's almost a sound in itself. During the day, it's all golden fields and blue skies, the epitome of American heartland beauty. But when the sun dips below that enormous horizon and the darkness rolls in like a heavy blanket, that same isolation can take on a far more unsettling quality. So there they were, Jake and Ellie, on that dark, quiet porch, the conversation dwindling as the night deepened. It was Jake who saw it first. He was idly gazing out towards the massive cornfield that bordered the property, a field that stretched like a dark, rustling ocean into the blackness. At first he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, a faint, flickering pinpoint of light, way out in the distance near the edge of the corn. He blinked, rubbed his eyes and looked again. No, it was definitely there. A soft, yellowish glow, bobbing gently, almost like someone was carrying an old-fashioned lantern. But who would be out there in the middle of nowhere at this time of night? Ellie initially was skeptical when Jake pointed it out. "Probably just a reflection, Jake," she'd said, not even bothering to look up from her phone, which was struggling for a signal. "Or maybe some kids messing around from the next farm over." But the next farm was a good 2 miles away, and this light, it didn't look like a modern flashlight beam. It had a warmer, more organic quality to it, and it moved with an odd, almost hesitant rhythm. Jake kept watching it, a knot of unease starting to form in his stomach. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something inherently wrong about that light, something that didn't belong. The light began to move, not erratically, but with a slow, deliberate drift along the edge of the corn rows, sometimes disappearing for a moment, as if obscured by the tall stalks, then reappearing. It wasn't behaving like a car's headlights, and it was too steady, too purposeful to be an animal with glowing eyes, if such a thing even existed out here. The glow it cast was subtle, not illuminating much beyond its immediate vicinity, which only added to its mysterious nature. It seemed to be beckoning, drawing the eye towards it, a solitary spark in an overwhelming darkness, and its presence was starting to feel less like a curiosity and more like a silent, watchful entity. They tried to rationalize it, of course. "Maybe it's old Mr. Henderson checking his fences," Jake offered, though he knew Mr. Henderson was well into his 80s and probably fast asleep. "Or someone got their car stuck on a dirt track back there," Ellie suggested, finally looking up. Her interest piqued, despite herself. But the light wasn't near any known track, and it wasn't accompanied by any sound. No engine, no voices, nothing. Just that silent, hovering glow. Each logical explanation they came up with seemed to evaporate as quickly as it was spoken, leaving behind a residue of growing dread and an undeniable pull towards the unexplained. And then the light did something that sent a shiver down Jake's spine. It stopped its lateral movement along the edge of the field and instead began to move slowly, purposefully, into the cornfield. Now, you have to understand, these Nebraska cornfields in late summer are like dense, impenetrable jungles. The stalks grow incredibly tall, well over a person's head, creating a claustrophobic labyrinth of green and shadow. The thought of anyone willingly venturing into that at night, guided only by a faint lantern, was deeply unsettling. The rustling of the dry leaves in the slight breeze suddenly sounded more ominous, like whispers from within the field itself. As the light receded deeper into the corn, Ellie, who had been dismissive at first, became strangely captivated. Her earlier nonchalance was replaced by an intense, almost trance-like focus on that single bobbing glow. Jake noticed the change in her immediately. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the point where the light had entered the field, and she seemed to be leaning forward, as if physically drawn to it. "Ellie," Jake said, his voice a little shaky, "let's just go inside. It's probably nothing." But Ellie didn't respond. She just kept staring, her expression unreadable in the dim light from the house. The defining moment came when Ellie slowly stood up from the porch swing, her gaze still locked on the cornfield. "I want to see what it is," she said, her voice quiet, almost monotone, completely unlike her usual self. Jake was horrified. "Are you crazy, Ellie? No way, we don't know what that is. It could be dangerous. We're going inside now." He tried to grab her arm, but she pulled away with surprising strength, her eyes still fixed on the darkness that had swallowed the light. Her determination was sudden and absolute, and it scared Jake more than the light itself. It was as if some unseen force was compelling her. Before Jake could react further, before he could physically stop her, Ellie was off the porch and walking, almost gliding, towards the cornfield. "Ellie, stop! Don't go in there!" Jake yelled, his voice cracking with panic. But it was like she couldn't hear him, or chose not to. She reached the edge of the towering stalks, paused for just a fraction of a second, and then, without looking back, she stepped into the dense, dark labyrinth of corn, disappearing from his sight. The sound of the cornstalks parting and then rustling closed behind her was one of the most sickening sounds Jake had ever heard, a sound that signalled she was now lost to him, consumed by the field and whatever lurked within it. Jake stood frozen on the porch, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He watched the spot where Ellie had vanished, his mind racing, a maelstrom of fear and disbelief. One moment she was there, his sister, and the next she was just gone, swallowed by the immense rustling darkness of the corn. He strained his ears, listening for any sound, any indication of where she was or what was happening, but all he could hear was the maddening whisper of the corn leaves in the night breeze and the frantic thumping of his own blood in his ears. He shouted her name over and over, "Ellie! Ellie, come back!" But only the echo, or what seemed like an echo, answered, quickly absorbed by the dense rows. Inside the cornfield we can only imagine what Ellie was experiencing, because the Ellie that went in was not entirely the Ellie that came out. The air within the rows would have been thick, humid and claustrophobic. The tall stalks would have pressed in from all sides, creating a disorienting maze where every direction looked the same. The only guide she would have had was that strange, bobbing lantern light, deeper now, leading her further and further from the edge of the field, further from safety, further from Jake. What did she see? What did she feel? Was she scared, or was she still under that strange compulsion that had drawn her in? And what of the Lantern Man, as Jake would later come to call this phenomenon? It's unlikely Ellie got a clear look at whatever or whoever was carrying that light. Perhaps it was always just out of reach, a flickering promise in the oppressive darkness, its source remaining tantalizingly obscured. Maybe it wasn't a man at all, but something else entirely, something ancient and tied to the land itself. The feeling of being watched, of being led by an unseen intelligence, must have been overwhelming. The light itself up close might have revealed an unnatural quality, a glow that wasn't quite right, a warmth that felt cold. Jake had no idea how long Ellie was actually in there. Minutes stretched into an eternity. He paced the edge of the yard, shouting her name until his throat was raw, his eyes scanning the impenetrable wall of corn for any sign of movement, any glimpse of her or the light. The farm, which had felt merely isolated before, now felt actively hostile. The darkness pressing in, the silence punctuated only by his own panicked cries and the relentless rustling of the corn. He thought about going in after her, but the sheer terror of entering that black, suffocating maze held him back. He was utterly alone with his fear and the horrifying unknown that had claimed his sister. Just when Jake was about to lose his mind completely, just when he was steeling himself to run back to the house, wake his grandparents and call for help, he wasn't even sure could do anything. He saw movement at the edge of the cornfield, not where Ellie had gone in, but a little further down. A figure stumbled out from between the stalks, and for a heart-stopping moment, Jake wasn't sure if it was her. Then the figure straightened slightly, and he recognized Ellie's silhouette against the faint starlight. Relief washed over him, so potent it almost buckled his knees. But that relief was short-lived, replaced almost instantly by a new, colder wave of dread. As Ellie walked slowly towards him, out of the shadows of the corn and into the dim light spilling from the porch, Jake could see that something was terribly wrong. Her clothes were torn in a few places and smudged with dirt. Her hair was dishevelled, filled with bits of leaf and tassel. That was to be expected, perhaps. But it was her face, her eyes, that made Jake's blood run cold. Her expression was utterly blank, her eyes wide and vacant, staring straight ahead as if she was looking at something far beyond him, or perhaps seeing nothing at all. There was no recognition in them, no relief at being out of the field, no fear, nothing, just an empty, haunted stillness. "Ellie? Ellie, are you okay? What happened in there?" Jake rushed towards her, his voice a torrent of anxious questions. He reached out to her, but she didn't react. She just kept walking, slowly, almost mechanically, past him towards the house. He gently took her arm, and it was like touching a statue. She didn't flinch, didn't speak. He tried again. "Ellie, talk to me. What did you see? Where's the light? Who was it?" Her lips were pale, slightly parted, but no words came out. It was as if the Ellie he knew, the vibrant, sometimes sarcastic, always present sister, had been hollowed out and replaced by this silent, empty shell. The walk back to the farmhouse porch was the longest, most terrifying walk of Jake's life. Ellie moved with a strange, unnerving calm, completely unresponsive to his frantic questions and pleas. The air around them felt thick, charged with an unspoken horror. Jake kept glancing back at the cornfield, half expecting to see the lantern light reappear, or worse, for something to come bursting out after them. But there was nothing, just the dark, silent rows of corn standing like sentinels guarding their secrets. The lantern man, or whatever it was, had vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared, leaving behind a profoundly changed Ellie and a deeply traumatized Jake. In the days and weeks that followed that horrifying night, it became chillingly clear that Ellie was not the same. The change was profound and deeply disturbing. She, who had always been talkative and expressive, became unnervingly quiet, often sitting for hours, just staring blankly into space. Her eyes focused on some distant point that no one else could see. She rarely initiated conversation, and when she did speak, her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Her words often clipped and monosyllabic. It was like a light inside her had been extinguished, or perhaps replaced by something else, something alien. Her behavior became increasingly erratic and unsettling. She developed a strange aversion to being outdoors after dusk, yet Jake would sometimes find her standing by her bedroom window late at night, just gazing out at the cornfield, her expression unreadable. She lost interest in things she used to love, her music, her books, talking to her friends back home. She ate little, slept fitfully, and sometimes Jake would hear her muttering softly in her sleep, though he could never make out the words. It was as if a part of her was still in that cornfield, still with whatever she had encountered there with the lantern man. Jake was beside himself with worry and fear. He tried desperately to get Ellie to talk about what happened, to tell him what she saw, what she experienced when she followed that eerie light into the corn. But she would either stare through him blankly, or sometimes a flicker of something akin to terror would cross her face before she shut down completely, retreating into her impenetrable silence. Their grandparents, noticing the drastic change in Ellie, were deeply concerned, but they too were at a loss. They took her to the local doctor, who could find nothing physically wrong, and suggested it might be some kind of stress reaction, a psychological episode. But Jake knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was something far beyond ordinary stress. And the cornfield itself, it took on a new, menacing presence in Jake's mind. He couldn't look at it without feeling a profound sense of dread, a feeling that it was watching him, waiting. The memory of that bobbing lantern light, Ellie's strange compulsion, and her horrifying transformation was seared into his consciousness. He never saw the lantern man again, but he felt its influence, its lingering shadow over their lives, over Ellie. The idyllic summer had turned into a waking nightmare, and the quiet Nebraska countryside now held a terror for him that was far more real and insidious than any ghost story he'd ever heard. The long-term impact on Ellie was sadly significant. While she did eventually regain some of her ability to communicate and interact with the world, she was never truly the same vibrant girl who had walked into that cornfield. A certain haunted quality remained in her eyes, a detachment that suggested a part of her was forever lost in that dark, rustling labyrinth. She would have good days and bad days, but the shadow of that night never fully lifted. Certain things would trigger a relapse into silence or a visible tremor of fear. The sight of a lantern, the rustling of dry leaves, or even just being near a large unlit field after dark. The encounter with the lantern man had left an indelible scar on her psyche. For Jake, the experience was a different kind of burden. He carried the weight of what he had witnessed, the helplessness he had felt, and a persistent gnawing guilt for not being able to stop Ellie, for not understanding the danger until it was too late. He became fiercely protective of her, but also deeply troubled by the secret they shared, a secret that no one else could truly comprehend. The world, for Jake, was no longer a straightforward place. He knew now that there were things out there, in the quiet, unassuming corners of the earth, that defied all logic and could irrevocably alter a life in a single, terrifying encounter. He eventually did some research, talking to older locals, discreetly asking about legends of lights in the fields. He found out that tales of a lantern man or similar apparitions were not uncommon in the region, though they were usually dismissed as folklore. Some stories spoke of it as a harmless will-o'-the-wisp, but others hinted at something more sinister, a being that lured people off paths, leading them to get lost, or worse, to encounter something they weren't meant to see. These fragmented tales offered no comfort, only a chilling confirmation that what they had experienced was part of a larger, darker pattern, a mystery woven into the very fabric of that rural landscape. And so the question remains, hanging in the air like the oppressive humidity of that Nebraska night: what exactly did Ellie encounter in that cornfield? What was the true nature of the Lantern Man, and what did it do to her, or what did it show her that changed her so profoundly? Some mysteries, it seems, are not meant to be solved, only endured. And for Jake and Ellie, the rustling of corn in the wind would forever be a reminder of the night. A simple, flickering light led them to the terrifying edge of the unknown, a place from which Ellie, in some fundamental way, never fully returned. All right, for our next journey into the unsettling, we're heading south, to the rolling hills and dense woodlands of rural Kentucky. This is a state known for its bourbon, its horse racing, and its beautiful, sometimes hauntingly isolated countryside. Dotted across this landscape are countless old farms, many of which have fallen into disrepair, their barns and outbuildings slowly surrendering to the relentless march of time and nature. These forgotten structures, weathered and worn, often become the subjects of local legends, whispered tales of strange occurrences, and, for the adventurous or foolhardy youth, irresistible targets for a dare. Our story centers on a teenager named Tyler and his close-knit group of friends. Let's call them Mark, Chris, and Sarah. They were typical high school kids, probably around 16 or 17, living in a small Kentucky town where excitement was often a self-made commodity. They were known for pushing boundaries, exploring abandoned places, and generally seeking out thrills that would break the monotony of small-town life. They weren't bad kids, just restless, with that youthful sense of invincibility that often precedes a harsh lesson in reality. And there was one local legend that had particularly captured their imaginations. It was the legend of the Screaming Barn. This was an old, dilapidated red barn located a few miles out of town on a long abandoned farmstead. Locals said that for decades, people had reported hearing terrifying screams emanating from within its crumbling walls, especially at night. Some said it was the tormented spirit of a farmer who'd met a gruesome end there. Others whispered of something far older and more malevolent. The stories varied, but the core element remained consistent: unearthly, blood-curdling screams that had no apparent source. Naturally, for Tyler and his friends, the Screaming Barn became the ultimate test of courage. The dare was simple: go to the barn after dark, go inside and stay for at least an hour. So one cool October evening, as dusk began to bleed across the Kentucky sky, painting it in shades of orange and deep purple, the four friends piled into Mark's beat-up truck and headed towards the infamous barn. There was a nervous energy in the air, a mixture of bravado, excitement, and a thin undercurrent of genuine apprehension. As they bumped along the overgrown dirt track leading to the abandoned farm, the barn came into view, a stark, decaying silhouette against the fading light. It looked even more imposing and sinister in person than it did in the stories, its broken windows like vacant eyes staring out at them, its weathered red paint peeling like sunburnt skin. As they parked the truck a little ways off, The sounds of the evening seemed to hush, as if the land itself was holding its breath, watching them. The barn loomed before them, a hulking mass of rotting wood and rusted metal. Its once vibrant red paint was now faded and blistered, great patches having peeled away to reveal the grey, weathered timber beneath. Several windows were shattered, dark, jagged holes gaping into the blackness within. The main doors sagged on their ancient hinges, one slightly ajar, like a mouth half open in a silent scream. The whole structure seemed to groan under its own weight, emitting low creaks and groans as the evening breeze sighed around its corners. With a mixture of feigned confidence and very real trepidation, Mark, being the unspoken leader of this particular expedition, gave the partially open barn door a tentative push. It protested with a long, drawn-out screech of rusted metal, a sound that made them all jump before slowly grating inwards. The air that wafted out from the dark interior was a potent cocktail of smells, a thick, musty odour of decades of dust and decay, the damp, earthy scent of rot, the faint, acrid tang of old animal manure, and something else, something indefinable, something vaguely unsettling that none of them could quite place, but which made the hairs on the back of their necks prickle. Flashlights flicked on, their beams cutting pale, dancing cones through the oppressive gloom. The interior of the barn was vast, much larger than it appeared from the outside. The main floor was littered with debris-broken boards, piles of old hay black with mould, rusted pieces of forgotten farm equipment that looked like a collection of medieval torture devices in the flickering light. Cobwebs, thick as shrouds, hung from the high rafters, swaying gently in the disturbed air. Pigeons, startled by their intrusion, cooed and fluttered in the shadowy recesses of the roof, their sudden movements causing a fresh wave of jitters among the group. As they ventured further inside, their youthful bravado began to falter, replaced by a growing sense of unease. Every creak of a floorboard underfoot, every rustle of unseen creatures in the straw, every distant hoot of an owl outside seemed amplified in the cavernous, tomb-like silence of the barn. Their nervous laughter and whispered jokes became fewer and further between. Tyler remembered feeling a cold knot tightening in his stomach. The place just felt wrong. It had an atmosphere, a heavy, palpable presence that seemed to press in on them, suffocating their initial excitement and replacing it with a primal urge to turn and flee. But of course, the dare was the dare. That's when they heard it, a sound that would haunt their memories for years to come. It started as a low, almost inaudible moan, drifting through the darkened barn like a wisp of smoke. Tyler froze, his breath catching in his throat. The others turned their flashlights towards the source, eyes wide with a mix of fear and curiosity. The moan grew louder, evolving into a guttural, anguished wail that seemed to reverberate through the very bones of the barn. It was unlike anything they had ever heard, a sound so filled with pain and despair that it seemed to pierce straight through to their souls. Mark, trying to maintain his composure, whispered, "Did you guys hear that?" His voice was shaky, betraying the fear he was trying to hide. Chris and Sarah nodded, their faces pale in the flashlight beams. The wail intensified, rising to a crescendo that made their ears ring and their hearts race. It was as if the walls themselves were crying out in agony. Tyler felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He wanted to run to get as far away from that barn as possible, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. Just when they thought they couldn't take it anymore, the wail abruptly stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. They stood there, hearts pounding, trying to make sense of what they had just experienced. The barn seemed to settle back into its oppressive stillness, but the air was charged with a new tension, a sense of foreboding that made their skin crawl. Tyler swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "Maybe we should go." But before they could move, the barn door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. The sound echoed through the cavernous space, and they were plunged into darkness as their flashlights flickered and died. Panic set in. They fumbled for the door, but it wouldn't budge. They were trapped, and the barn seemed to come alive around them, creaking and groaning as if it were a living, breathing entity. And then From the shadows came the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving towards them. Tyler's heart raced as he realized they were not alone in the screaming barn. They'd been inside for maybe 20 minutes, their flashlights nervously sweeping across the shadowy corners and up into the cavernous, web-draped rafters. They'd made a half-hearted attempt to explore, peering into empty animal stalls and kicking at piles of debris, all while trying to maintain an air of nonchalance. But the oppressive atmosphere of the barn was starting to get to them. It was Chris who first claimed to hear something. "Did you guys hear that?" he whispered, his flashlight beam frozen on a dark corner of the loft above. It sounded like a moan or someone sighing. Mark scoffed. "Probably just the wind, man, or the buildings settling. This place is ancient." But then Sarah shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "It's freezing in here all of a sudden," she said, her breath misting slightly in her flashlight beam, even though the October night outside had been relatively mild. And she was right. A distinct chill had permeated the air in their immediate vicinity. A damp cold that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the barn. A cold that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. Goosebumps rose on Tyler's arms. He too had felt the sudden drop in temperature, and he couldn't shake the distinct, unnerving sensation that they were not alone. That unseen eyes were watching their every move from the Stygian blackness of the barn's deeper recesses. It was around this time that Chris, clearly the most spooked of the group, muttered, "You know what? I think I've had enough. This place gives me the creeps. Maybe an hour is too long." Part of Tyler silently agreed with him, every instinct screaming at him to get out. But Mark, ever the one to push things, just laughed, though it sounded a little forced. "What? You scared Chris? We just got here. Don't tell me you believe those stupid stories." Peer pressure, that powerful, often regrettable force, kept them rooted to the spot. No one wanted to be the first to truly chicken out, to admit defeat to an old empty barn and a few spooky tales. The moments that followed were thick with an almost unbearable tension. The playful banter had completely ceased. Now there was only the sound of their own breathing, the occasional nervous cough, and the incessant subtle creaks and groans of the ancient structure around them. The silence deepened, becoming heavy, almost suffocating, pressing down on them. It was the kind of silence that feels like a coiled spring, wound tighter and tighter, just waiting for something to snap. And then it happened. A sound cut through the stillness, sharp and clear, making them all freeze in place. It wasn't a creak, it wasn't the wind, it was a scream. A distant, high-pitched, undeniably human-sounding scream. That first scream, it wasn't overwhelmingly loud, but it was utterly unmistakable and terrifyingly clear. It seemed to come from somewhere deep within the barn, perhaps from the hayloft above, or one of the lightless rooms off to the side. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror, or perhaps agony, and it sliced through the tense silence like a razor blade. For a split second, nobody moved, nobody breathed. They just stood there, flashlights trembling in their hands, their faces pale masks of shock and disbelief. Had they really heard that? Or was it their imaginations finally succumbing to the barn's oppressive atmosphere and the power of suggestion from the local legends? Then, before anyone could voice a word, before they could even process that first horrifying sound, another scream ripped through the air. This one was closer, louder, and it was joined almost immediately by another and then another, until the entire barn seemed to be filled with a cacophony of shrieks, wails, and tortured cries. It was a chorus from hell, a symphony of suffering that seemed to emanate from all around them, from above, from below, from the very walls themselves. Some screams sounded male, some female, some ageless and inhuman. They overlapped, echoed, and reverberated through the cavernous space, creating a disorienting and utterly terrifying wall of sound. Panic, raw and absolute, erupted. The four friends who moments before had been trying to project an image of cool bravado were now reduced to a primal state of terror. They started shouting, screaming themselves, their flashlights waving erratically, casting wild dancing shadows that only added to the nightmarish chaos. They bumped into each other, stumbled over unseen obstacles, completely disoriented by the auditory assault. The carefully constructed dare, the thrill-seeking adventure, had instantaneously devolved into a desperate, terrifying fight for survival against an unseen, unidentifiable and horrifically vocal enemy. Tyler would later recall a specific chilling detail from that maelstrom of terror. At one point, as he was scrambling blindly, a scream seemed to erupt right next to his ear, so close, so piercing, that he physically recoiled, clapping his hands over his ears, even though it did little to block out the overwhelming noise. He felt a cold breath on the back of his neck, even as the screams seemed to surround him, to target him, as if whatever was making those sounds knew he was there and was reveling in his fear. He had a fleeting, horrifying thought that the barn wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it was angry. The instinct to flee was overwhelming, a primal urge that drowned out all other thoughts. Finding the exit, the heavy door they had entered through what felt like an eternity ago became their only focus. But in the darkness, amidst the terrifying cacophony of screams and their own panicked shouts, it was like navigating a nightmare landscape. The barn, which had seemed merely large and dilapidated before, now felt like a malevolent, shifting labyrinth, its shadows filled with unseen terrors. The screams intensified, seeming to follow them, to mock their efforts, to chase them towards the elusive promise of safety. Their desperate scramble for the door was fraught with obstacles. Old tools and broken boards, unseen in the gloom, became treacherous tripping hazards. Tyler remembered stumbling over a pile of something soft, old sacks, maybe, and falling hard, the wind knocked out of him, his flashlight clattering away into the darkness. For a terrifying moment, he was alone in the pitch black, the screams seeming to close in on him, and he truly believed he wouldn't make it out. He felt a hand grab his arm. "Mark," he thought, hauling him back to his feet, and they pushed on, driven by sheer adrenaline and terror. It felt as though the barn itself was actively trying to prevent their escape. A loose board from the loft above crashed down nearby, narrowly missing Chris, showering them with dust and splinters. The very air seemed to thicken, making it hard to breathe, heavy with the stench of decay and something else, something acrid and foul that burned their nostrils. The screams were relentless, a barrage of auditory torment that frayed their nerves to the breaking point. Each one of them was convinced that at any moment, something tangible, something monstrous would emerge from the shadows and grab them. And then, finally, blessedly, they saw it, a faint rectangle of slightly less impenetrable darkness. The door. They practically threw themselves at it, fumbling with the latch, their hands slick with sweat. With a collective, desperate shove, the ancient door groaned open, and they burst out of the screaming barn and into the relative calm of the Kentucky night, gasping for air, hearts pounding like war drums in their chests. They didn't stop running until they reached the truck, piling in, fumbling with the keys and speeding away from that place of horrors as fast as the old engine would allow, leaving the screaming barn to its dark secrets and its unholy chorus. Once they were a safe distance away, parked on the side of a deserted country road, the engine ticking in the sudden, shocking silence, the immediate aftermath of their ordeal began to set in. Mark, Chris and Sarah were all visibly shaken, pale and trembling, recounting fragmented, terrified impressions of what they had just experienced. They were scared, deeply scared, but it was Tyler who seemed to be the most profoundly affected. While the others babbled nervously, trying to make sense of the senseless, Tyler was unnervingly quiet. He just sat there in the back seat, staring straight ahead, his body rigid, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. In the days and weeks that followed, the change in Tyler became increasingly apparent and alarming. He became withdrawn and sullen, a shadow of his former self. The easygoing, adventurous teenager was replaced by a jumpy, anxious young man who seemed to live on a knife edge of fear. He suffered from terrible nightmares, waking up screaming, drenched in sweat, reliving those terrifying moments in the barn over and over again. He refused to talk about what had happened in any detail, even to his closest friends. If they tried to bring it up, he would either shut down completely or become inexplicably agitated, almost aggressive. His personality underwent a noticeable shift. He, who had once loved exploring and seeking out thrills, now avoided any situation that remotely reminded him of the barn. He developed a severe aversion to enclosed spaces, particularly old or dark ones. The sound of a door creaking, a sudden loud noise, even the rustling of leaves in the wind at night could send him into a state of near panic. He became jumpy, irritable and profoundly paranoid, convinced that something from the barn had followed him, or that the screams were still echoing somewhere in the recesses of his mind, waiting to resurface. His friends, while also traumatized by the experience, didn't seem to be unraveling in the same way Tyler was. They were scared, yes, and they certainly wouldn't be going back to the screaming barn anytime soon, but they were able to talk about it, to try and rationalize it, to process it, however inadequately. They were worried about Tyler, of course. They tried to support him, but they couldn't truly understand the depth of his terror, the way the experience seemed to have burrowed itself deep into his soul. There was a growing sense among them that Tyler had perhaps seen or experienced something more, something different, something even more terrifying than the shared horror of the screams. For Tyler, the screaming barn wasn't just a scary story or a dare gone wrong. It became a source of deep, lasting trauma. He never fully recovered from that night. While the acute symptoms of his fear eventually subsided with time and, reportedly, some professional help, a certain haunted quality remained. He carried the weight of that experience, the memory of those inexplicable, terrifying screams, like a physical burden. The barn, even just the thought of it, became his personal symbol of ultimate horror, a place where the veil between worlds or between sanity and madness had been irrevocably torn. Did anyone ever go back to the screaming barn? As far as Tyler and his friends were concerned, it was off-limits forever. The legend, however, likely only grew stronger, fueled by their terrifying account, which undoubtedly, despite their initial reluctance to speak, would have eventually trickled out into the local gossip mill, adding another chilling chapter to the barn's dark history. Perhaps the barn still stands, a decaying monument to the unknown, its secrets locked within its rotting timbers, its screams waiting for the next unwary souls to venture too close. Or perhaps nature has finally reclaimed it, pulling it down into the earth, an attempt to silence its horrifying chorus. The psychological toll of experiencing such intense, inexplicable terror is hard to overstate. When you're confronted with something that shatters your understanding of reality, something that your mind simply cannot process or explain away, it leaves a profound and lasting scar. What truly caused those screams in the barn? Was it a collective hallucination, a trick of acoustics, or something genuinely supernatural, a tormented echo of past events, or an entity bound to that desolate place? These are questions that Tyler would likely grapple with for the rest of his life. Questions without comforting answers. And that's the truly unsettling part of Tyler's story. It's not just about a haunted barn. It's about the fragility of the human psyche when faced with the inexplicable and the terrifying. It's a stark reminder that some doors are best left unopened, some legends are best left untested, because sometimes what you find on the other side, or what finds you, can unleash a terror so profound that its echoes will reverberate through your life forever. A constant, chilling reminder of the night you heard the screaming barn, and it screamed right back into your soul. All right, so for our third story, we're heading out to the rolling hills and vast farmlands of rural Pennsylvania, a place called Hollow Creek. Now, Hollow Creek is the kind of town where everybody knows everybody, and the rhythm of life is dictated by the seasons, especially the harvest. It's a picturesque place, you know, with old farmhouses, endless fields of corn and wheat, and a sense of quiet that can feel incredibly peaceful. But like so many peaceful places, Hollow Creek has its own shadow, a story whispered down through generations, a local legend that surfaces most prominently when the crops are high and the air turns crisp. They call her the Harvest Bride. The legend of the Harvest Bride is a tragic one, as these stories often are. It speaks of a young woman from a bygone era, jilted at the altar, or perhaps met with a terrible fate on her wedding day, right as the harvest season was reaching its peak. Details vary, of course, depending on who you ask. Some say she was a farmer's daughter who vanished into the fields, searching for her lost love, her white wedding dress becoming a spectral beacon against the golden crops. Others claim she was a more vengeful spirit, betrayed and heartbroken, forever roaming the farmlands, her sorrow so profound it chills the very soil. All right, so for our third story, we're heading out to the rolling hills and vast farmlands of rural Pennsylvania, a place called Hollow Creek. Now, Hollow Creek is the kind of town where everybody knows everybody, and the rhythm of life is dictated by the seasons, especially the harvest. It's a picturesque place, you know, with old farmhouses, endless fields of corn and wheat, and a sense of quiet that can feel incredibly peaceful. But like so many peaceful places, Hollow Creek has its own shadow, a story whispered down through generations, a local legend that surfaces most prominently when the crops are high and the air turns crisp. They call her the Harvest Bride. The legend of the Harvest Bride is a tragic one, as these stories often are. It speaks of a young woman from a bygone era, jilted at the altar, or perhaps met with a terrible fate on her wedding day, right as the harvest season was reaching its peak. Details vary, of course, depending on who you ask. Some say she was a farmer's daughter who vanished into the fields, searching for her lost love, her white wedding dress becoming a spectral beacon against the golden crops. Others claim she was a more vengeful spirit, betrayed and heartbroken, forever roaming the farmlands, her sorrow so profound it chills the very soil. Living right in the heart of this unfolding unease was a young woman named Sarah. Sarah was a farmer's daughter, born and raised in Hollow Creek, and her family's land bordered some of the oldest, most sprawling fields in the area. She was around 19, home from her first year of college for the summer, helping out on the farm like she always did. Sarah was practical, not one for flights of fancy or ghost stories. She'd heard the tales of the Harvest Bride her whole life, of course, and had always rolled her eyes at them, considering them nothing more than local folklore, designed to spook gullible kids. But that summer, something felt different to Sarah. It started subtly. Sometimes, when she was out near the cornfields, especially as dusk began to settle, she'd get this prickling sensation on the back of her neck, like she was being observed. She'd spin around, expecting to see her younger brother playing a prank, or maybe one of the farm hands, but there was never anyone there. Just the endless rows of corn, rustling in the breeze, casting long dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist in ways that made her stomach clench just a little. She tried to brush it off, telling herself it was just the isolation, the way sound carried strangely through the dense stalks, or maybe just the power of suggestion from all those old stories. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger each day. Then came the sounds. Faint at first, almost imperceptible, a soft sighing like wind, but there would be no breeze. Or what sounded like the faintest whisper of fabric, like a long dress brushing against dry leaves, even when the ground around her was clear. These were sounds she couldn't easily dismiss, sounds that didn't quite fit the natural ambience of the farm she knew so well. One evening, Sarah was walking back to the farmhouse after securing a gate at the far end of their property. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. As she passed by a particularly dense section of the cornfield, she saw it, or thought she did, a flicker of white deep within the rows, too tall to be an animal, too still to be the wind playing tricks. It was there for just a second, and then it was gone. Her heart hammered in her chest. She told herself it was a deer or a trick of the fading light, but a cold dread began to seep into her, a dread that the stories might not be just stories after all. Sarah started sleeping with her window closed, something she rarely did, even on cooler summer nights. She found herself avoiding the edges of the fields, especially after dark, her old confidence replaced by a gnawing anxiety. She even started taking the longer, more open route back to the house, rather than cutting through the narrow paths between the corn rows. Her parents noticed her unease. Her father, a stoic man of the land, tried to reassure her, blaming it on an overactive imagination, perhaps fueled by too many late nights or the stress of upcoming college decisions. Her mother, a bit more attuned to the undercurrents of the town, just looked at her with a worried expression but didn't press. Her younger brother, Tom, who was about 15, initially found her newfound nervousness amusing. He'd try to jump out from behind doors or make spooky noises, trying to get a rise out of her. But even he started to sense that Sarah's fear was genuine, not something she was putting on. One afternoon, while they were mending a fence line together, relatively far from the densest part of the corn, Sarah confided in him a little, telling him about the feeling of being watched and the fleeting glimpses of white she couldn't explain. Tom, surprisingly, didn't laugh. Instead, he admitted that he too had felt weird vibes out near the old Miller farm, which bordered theirs. This small admission from Tom, though vague, was enough to validate Sarah's fears, at least in her own mind. She wasn't imagining it. Something was out there. The feeling of being watched became almost constant whenever she was outside, especially near the fields. It was like a heavy blanket pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe sometimes. She'd find herself scanning the tree lines, the gaps in the corn, her eyes darting around, searching for the source of her unease. But she never saw anything concrete, just those fleeting, almost subliminal flickers that could so easily be dismissed. The local community, meanwhile, was abuzz with its own scattered reports. An elderly woman claimed to have seen a figure in white gliding across her back pasture in the pre-dawn mist. A group of teenagers, out later than they should have been, swore they heard eerie, sorrowful singing coming from deep within the Henderson corn maze, a popular local attraction during the fall. Each story, taken alone, could be explained away. But together, they started to paint a disturbing picture, one that made the old legend of the Harvest Bride feel chillingly relevant once more. And for Sarah, the feeling was that this presence, whatever it was getting closer. As summer bled into early autumn, the harvest season in Hollow Creek kicked into high gear. The days grew shorter, the nights cooler, and the fields were a hive of activity as farmers rushed to bring in their crops. The annual Harvest Moon Festival was approaching, a time of celebration for the community. But this year, an undercurrent of trepidation ran beneath the usual festive spirit. The stories of the Harvest Bride were on everyone's lips, no longer just idle gossip, but a topic of genuine concern for some. Sarah, for her part, felt the oppressive atmosphere more keenly than ever. The farm work was demanding, often stretching late into the evening under the harsh glare of floodlights mounted on tractors and combines. One particularly late night, Sarah was helping her father and a couple of farmhands finish up a section of their largest cornfield. It was well past midnight, the sky was clear, and a brilliant, almost unnervingly bright harvest moon hung overhead, casting long, eerie shadows. They were tired, pushing to get the last few rows done before a predicted rainstorm. Sarah was on foot, checking for any missed ears of corn behind the massive combine harvester. As she moved further away from the noise and lights of the machinery, deeper into the unharvested rows, a sudden profound silence fell around her. The crickets stopped chirping. The distant hum of the combine seemed to fade. It was as if the world had momentarily held its breath, and then she heard it, a soft, melancholic humming seeming to come from just a few rows over. It was a distinctly female voice, a wordless tune that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. Sarah froze, her blood turning to ice. This was no trick of the wind, no animal sound. This was real. She slowly, very slowly, parted the tall corn stalks in front of her, peering into the moonlit darkness between the rows. And there, standing about 30 feet away, was a figure. It was tall and slender, draped in what looked like a flowing white garment that seemed to almost glow in the moonlight. The figure's back was to her, its head slightly bowed. as if in sorrow or contemplation. Sarah couldn't make out any features, just the silhouette and the undeniable presence. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. The humming continued, a haunting melody that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, Sarah managed to break free from her paralysis. She stumbled backwards, a choked gasp escaping her lips, and turned and fled, crashing through the cornstalks, back towards the lights and the reassuring noise of the combine. She didn't dare look back. When she reached her father, she was pale and trembling, barely able to articulate what she had seen. Her father, pragmatic as ever, attributed it to exhaustion and the eerie moonlight playing tricks on her eyes, though he did seem a bit more shaken than usual by her evident terror. They packed up quickly after that. The remaining rows left for another day. Sarah, however, couldn't shake the image of the figure in white. It was burned into her mind. She knew what she had seen. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was the Harvest Bride. She tried to tell her older brother, David, about it. David was home for a weekend visit from his tech job in the city. He was even more skeptical than their father, a firm believer in logic and science. He listened to her story with a patient but unconvinced air, suggesting it was probably just a local prankster or even a lost hiker, magnified by fear and local legend. He found the whole idea of a spectral bride wandering the cornfields utterly absurd, frustrated by his dismissal and desperate for some kind of proof, or even just to understand what was happening. Sarah argued with him. "If you're so sure it's nothing," she challenged, "then prove it. You're always messing around with that fancy drone of yours. Why don't you fly it over the fields at night? See what you can find." David owned a high-quality drone with a good night vision camera, something he usually used for capturing scenic landscape shots or inspecting their property from above. He initially scoffed at the idea, calling it a waste of time. But Sarah was persistent, and perhaps a small part of David, the part that still remembered the spooky stories from his own childhood in Hollow Creek, was a little intrigued. Or maybe he just wanted to definitively prove her wrong and put an end to what he saw as mass hysteria. So after some back and forth, he reluctantly agreed. "Fine," he said, "I'll fly the drone, we'll scan the fields. And when we find nothing but raccoons and deer, maybe everyone can finally calm down about this ridiculous ghost story." He had no idea what he was about to unleash. So, the next evening, as dusk began to settle over Hollow Creek, David prepared his drone. He chose a location on the edge of their property that gave him a good vantage point over the vast, unharvested sections of their land and the neighbouring Miller farm, where some of the sightings had been reported. Sarah stood beside him, a knot of anxiety and anticipation in her stomach. Tom, their younger brother, was there too, a mixture of excitement and fear on his face. The air was still and cool, the silence of the countryside amplifying every little sound, the chirp of a distant cricket, the rustle of leaves in a far-off tree. David launched the drone, its small propellers whirring to life, and sent it soaring up into the darkening sky. He had the live feed displayed on a tablet, the night vision camera cutting through the gloom, rendering the landscape in eerie shades of green and black. For the first 20 minutes or so, the flight was uneventful. They scanned row after row of corn, the dense woods bordering the fields, and the old, dilapidated barn on the Miller property. They saw a few deer, a startled raccoon, and plenty of swaying corn stalks, but nothing out of the ordinary. David was starting to look smug. "See?" he said, glancing at Sarah. "Nothing." But Sarah urged him to keep looking, to fly it closer to the area where she'd had her encounter. Reluctantly, David maneuvered the drone towards that specific section of their field, and then it happened. On the screen, a flicker of white. At first, David thought it was an anomaly, a glitch in the camera, or maybe just a plastic bag caught on a fence. But as he brought the drone in for a closer, slower pass, the image sharpened. It was unmistakably a humanoid figure, standing eerily still at the edge of a corn row, partially obscured by the tall stalks. It was draped in what looked like a long, pale garment, The figure didn't move like a person. It seemed to glide, almost float, when it did shift its position. It was tall, unnaturally so, and though the night vision obscured fine details, there was an undeniable aura of something wrong about it. Even David went quiet, his smug expression replaced by one of stunned disbelief. The figure then slowly turned its upper body towards the drone, though no face was discernible in the grainy footage. It just faced it. And then, as quickly as it appeared, it seemed to recede back into the deepest shadows of the corn, vanishing from the camera's view. They searched for another 10 minutes, but it was gone. David landed the drone, his hands visibly shaking. No one spoke for a long moment. The footage was undeniable. It wasn't a prankster, it wasn't an animal. Whatever they had captured on that drone was something else entirely, something that defied easy explanation. David, the staunch skeptic, was now confronted with evidence that he couldn't rationalize away. He replayed the short clip over and over, his face pale. Sarah felt a strange mix of vindication and sheer terror. She had known it was real, but seeing it so clearly, so undeniably captured on camera, was a different kind of horrifying. Word of the drone footage spread like wildfire through Hollow Creek, and then, inevitably, beyond. David, initially hesitant, was eventually convinced by friends to upload a short, stabilized clip of the encounter online, hoping someone could offer a rational explanation. Instead, the footage went viral. It was picked up by paranormal forums, YouTube channels, and even some local news outlets. The Harvest Bride of Hollow Creek became an internet sensation. Experts and debunkers weighed in, some claiming it was a clever hoax, others admitting it was deeply unsettling and difficult to explain. The footage was analysed frame by frame, but no definitive answers emerged. For the residents of Hollow Creek, life changed. The town became a minor tourist attraction for ghost hunters and curious thrill-seekers, much to the annoyance of many locals. The fields, once symbols of their livelihood, now held a more sinister connotation for some. Sarah and her family, particularly David, found themselves at the centre of unwanted attention. David, once so dismissive, became far more reserved and thoughtful. He never flew his drone over the fields at night again. He didn't need to. He knew what was out there. The sightings of the Harvest Bride didn't stop, though perhaps people were more reluctant to talk about them openly, fearing ridicule or unwanted attention. The legend, once a quaint piece of folklore, had become a chilling reality for the community. A constant reminder that some things are not easily explained by logic or science. And as the harvest season returns each year to Hollow Creek, and the corn grows tall and dense, there's a lingering fear. A sense that the Harvest Bride is still out there, wandering the moonlit fields, a sorrowful, spectral guardian of the land, forever tied to the cycle of growth and decay, and the strange, dark and mysterious heart of the countryside. The countryside, with its vast open spaces and seemingly peaceful landscapes, it really can lull you into a false sense of security, can't it? You see those rolling hills, the quiet old farmhouses, the dense whispering woods, and you think of tranquility, of a simpler way of life. But as we've explored in these stories tonight, that idyllic veneer can sometimes conceal things that are far from peaceful. Behind every quiet hill or within the shadows of an abandoned barn, there might just be something older, something darker, something waiting. It's a reminder that the world is full of mysteries we haven't even begun to unravel. Think about Ellie, drawn into the corn by an unexplainable light, forever changed by her encounter with the Lantern Man in those Nebraskan fields. Or Tyler and his friends, their youthful bravado shattered by the terrifying, unearthly screams echoing from that abandoned red barn in Kentucky, leaving Tyler a shadow of his former self. And of course, the unsettling enigma of the Harvest Bride in rural Pennsylvania, a local legend made terrifyingly real, captured on drone footage for the whole world to see, yet still unexplained, still out there. These aren't just campfire tales, they're rooted in real places experienced by real people. These stories serve as a stark reminder that the strange, dark and mysterious isn't confined to haunted houses or ancient graveyards. It can be found in the places we least expect it, in the quiet corners of our world where the modern hustle and bustle hasn't quite managed to pave over every secret. If these true tales sent a shiver down your spine, and you appreciate stories that delve into the unsettling and the unexplained, then please do us a huge favor and introduce the like button to the strange, dark and mysterious by giving it a firm tap. And be sure to subscribe to this channel, Moneymaker, for more chilling true tales just like these. We're always digging up new accounts. And finally, we really want to hear from you. The countryside holds so many secrets, and we know that many of you out there have your own stories, your own unexplained encounters. Have you ever experienced something strange, something unsettling out in a rural area? Maybe a weird light in the woods? An unexplained sound in an old building, or a feeling of being watched when you knew you were alone? If you have, please share your experience in the comments below. Your story could be the one that helps someone else understand they're not alone in what they've witnessed. Stay safe out there, and always be aware